So it's a really tall task, what we're here to talk about today, how you utilize the resources, not only of just Texas, but the world that we're using in a sustainable way going forward. But I do think Texans are up for it. The case in point was made to me about a year ago relative to the pace of the transition. In my previous role, I was the head of developments for BP's Gulf of Mexico and Canada business, but I was also asked to be the chief transformation officer of that business and take a look at how BP was positioning itself going forward in a pace and a period of rapid transition. So I was attending a leadership seminar with an individual named John Coyle. He's an Olympic gold medalist, he's a Tour de France winner, and he had a lot of insight relative to how companies position themselves and what the leadership model is going forward. There were a lot of aha moments for me during that leadership seminar over a couple days, but the biggest one that I took away from that is when he said, "Your slowest day is today." And I think that really stuck with me from the perspective of going forward, transformation is going to be inevitable. There's going to be more interconnectivity, more artificial intelligence, more digital, faster pace, more fake news, social networking. There will never be less than what we have today. Today is your slowest day. So how do you prepare yourself, your family, and your company for a rapidly transforming world? And I think that's the challenge that many of us in this room are facing right now. BP has had to face the nature of the pace of transformation. And in February of 2022, last year, we announced its new purpose, and that is to reimagine energy for people and our planet. To change at that scale and magnitude, we knew that would require reinventing our company from the inside out after operating in a way for more than 100 years. We also laid out a new ambition to reach net zero by 2050 or sooner, and most importantly, to help the world do the same. As part of this reinvention, we've also undertaken a new strategy. It seems subtle in terms, but it's really big. How do you go from an international oil company, an IOC, to an integrated energy company, an IEC, which delivers solutions and energy solutions for its customers around the world? It's a big task ahead, but we're already achieving measurable results, and we'll see more this decade. Now, we've already reduced our carbon footprint in every aspect of our global business, from emissions to the potential for capturing carbon. We are going to draw down our oil and gas production by 40%. We're scaling up renewables in critical sectors, and we're investing in low carbon opportunities. We've spent a lot of time listening to what people had to say about BP and its future, and it's probably not that much different from what other industries, both in energy and outside, are hearing from people who have a stake in those industries. And the reality is we learned we had to change. But we want to change because the world right now is on an unsustainable path. It doesn't matter what side of the spectrum you're on regarding the transition and the energy transition, change is inevitable. And how you position your company and the partnerships and advocacy that you have going forward is going to be critical. So what we did, as I talked about the reinvention, once we realized that this transformation was inevitable, we did what we called Reinvented BP from the inside out, within a sustainability frame that creates 3 major focus areas and then aims within each of these focus areas. We've got 10 aims to get BP to net zero and to help the world achieve net zero. We've got 5 aims for caring for our planet, and I'll talk more in depth about that later. And we have 5 aims for improving people's lives, dramatically different from the shareholder statements that we would have made and the company position and strategy that we would have had even 5 years ago. As part of this, we're actively engaging stakeholders and embedding these focus areas into our corporate DNA. We're creating a governance structure, we'll talk more about that measures our achievement towards targets. And I'll also talk about how we're going to be enhancing the capability and, most importantly, the mindset. Largely the mindset we want is the mindset in this room of the employees that work for BP. As with all major transitions, this one's no different. How you go from an IOC to an IEC, the real challenge at the heart of it is the pace. How do you remain profitable to shareholders in the near and midterm, where the majority of the energy that the world needs is going to come from hydrocarbon? And I do think it's clear that the social and policy dynamic and discussions over the next 5 to 10 years are going to determine that pace of change. There's multiple scenarios for how it's going to advance, but I think the end state of that transition is pretty inevitable. And that's why BP needed to position itself through this framework to capture the opportunities of being a leader in the transition, and this is going to be really important. I'll talk about that, advocating for responsible change. So how do we transition, and what's our progress to date? So I think when we've talked to our investors, not only them, but the citizens of the cities and states and countries in which we operate, we've found the consistent theme is they're all demanding visible and transparent targets. And they're also expecting a governance framework that makes achievement of these targets transparent. So number one, you need targets, and you need a governance structure that makes sure you're on pace to deliver on those targets. And two, this is really important, we were talking about this before the session kicked off amongst the panel, you need an engine for change. We've been very, very clear that oil and gas are a key pillar of BP's strategy going forward, and it's going to remain that way for quite some time. It is, for us, the engine that drives the transition, and will provide the cash flow needed to fund BP's transition into that IEC, or integrated energy company. Now, having said all that, we're definitely not holding back on what we're doing today. We're working diligently to reduce our carbon footprint in every aspect of our global business. I mentioned we're drawing down oil and gas production by 40%. And the key part of our hydrocarbon business is focusing on the high margin barrels and in the areas that we know best. We're running the best oil and gas business possible, not the biggest. It's a big distinction right there. BP is focusing on value, not volume, to create that engine that helps us on that transition over the next few years and decades. So we have the engine room to propel that transition. We have targets established, which I'll talk about soon. But first, I do want to talk about BP's position in Texas. And I think this is important because it can really help set the scene for how we're contributing to those targets locally, and how that local scene transfers globally. BP has a really strong track record and presence in Texas. We support 4,000 direct jobs in the state and 20,000 plus indirect jobs. We paid $470 million in property royalties, environmental and state local income and franchise taxes. And to a large extent, what we do in Texas is a microcosm of our global portfolio, with nearly all of our businesses represented within the state. We have our U.S. headquarters in Houston. It's the largest employee hub that we have anywhere in the world. And Houston is also home to our Gulf of Mexico business, in which we're one of the U.S.'s top deepwater producers. We've got BP Wind, which operates 9 wind farms in 6 states, and we have equity in a 10th wind farm. And we have Gas and Power Trading Americas, which is America's #1 marketer of natural gas, and one of the top energy marketers in North America, in the top 5 with ERCOT. Elsewhere in Texas, we have BP X Energy, which operates world-class unconventional oil assets in the Permian and Delaware, the Eagle Ford and Haynesville basins, both in Texas and Louisiana. And we currently produce around 325,000 barrels of oil equivalent per day. We have equity in a company called Lightsource BP, which currently completed its first solar farm in Lamar County, 150 miles north of here. It's going to generate 450,000 megawatt hours of solar power annually, which is the equivalent enough to power 41,000 US homes in the Texas market. And BP has signed a 20-year liquefaction contract with the liquefied natural gas terminal in Freeport, Texas. So Texas is an incredibly opportunity-rich landscape. It provides a landscape for new partnerships, and it also helps support our energy transition. BP is going to continue to focus on the US, BP is going to continue to focus on Texas, and within Texas, 3 main areas. Of course, the oil and gas areas that we operate, but on energy efficiency. The biggest US opportunity that we see in the energy transition exists on the US Gulf Coast. where we're going to focus on making the region more energy efficient and less emissions intensive. In wind, Texas has the largest installed wind generating capacity in the US, over 33,000 megawatts installed, and we're going to be focusing on solar. We have the second largest installed solar capacity in the US, Texas does, at over 6,800 megawatts. So if you do consider this on a global scale, doing it here, which we are, provides the blueprint to move the dial globally. So now on to our targets. BP certainly has that strong presence in Texas and nationally within the US, but we're also a global operator. So how do you take these local businesses and what we're doing here and transfer it to the cities and countries around the world where we operate? You've got to have targets, and you've got to have the governance framework to make sure you're on pace. By 2025, we want to reduce methane by committing to zero routine flaring in the US onshore operations. We want to cut emissions from our global operations and our oil and gas by 20% on an absolute basis. And we want to build 20 gigawatts of renewable energy, up from 2.5 gigawatts in 2020. By 2030, we want to cut our oil and gas production against a 2019 baseline by greater than 40%, and we want to realize a 10 times increase in low carbon investments in areas like wind, solar, hydrogen, that's going to create 50 gigawatts of renewable power. And this is what I really find inspiring about this and what I think is applicable to this room. We want to build partnerships with 10 to 15 cities and 3 core industries globally. It's a big reposition of the company. I think the framework that we've put together encompassing these is different, but we're already seeing results from that, and we're already in action on quite a bit. But you're not going to achieve them at scale without something that we've termed as a core part of our strategy called advocacy. We were very purposeful in putting that as a central pillar of the overall strategy. It's not just talking about our communications and our public relations, it's actually advocating for that change and seeking out those partnerships with those companies, with those individuals, with those conservation groups that have the same like-minded goals, that are in alignment with our strategy. And then integral to the delivery of our aims is establishing trust with our critical external stakeholders, the regulators, the policymakers, environmental, non-government organization, or ENGOs, and with academia. We've been actively engaging with our stakeholders to maintain this type of dialogue so that as we deliver on our aims, we bring the rest of those partnerships along with us, and then we look for and establish new ones. Some examples of these collaborations include our effort to end routine flaring in Texas, in coordination with our external stakeholder, the Environmental Defense Fund. We're actively advocating for cap and invest in Washington State, and we're already in action advocating for the direct federal regulation of methane, and we're supporting carbon pricing policies within the US. Very different as kind of a corporate steward of where we see the world going and integral to our strategy. Just as important to our direct ambitions is partnering with the cities in which we operate. And I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about a particular area that we're in partnership on the Houston Climate Action Plan. For the past year, BP served as the city's strategic and technical planning advisor on the CAP, that Climate Action Plan. We're using our expertise across the energy spectrum to help the city of Houston build a more sustainable and a resilient future. Together, it's early days, but we've already made real progress. I want to talk to you about EV charging hubs, Greentown Labs, Sunnyside Energy, LLC, though I could list a couple more, but those are the ones paramount to what we're doing. On the EV charging hubs, we're enabling transport electrification with support from the city and working with Uber to jointly develop and install high-speed EV charging hubs with the goal of providing fast charging for both ride-hailing and public EV users. We're creating opportunities for green tech innovation with BP sponsoring Greentown Labs and supporting efforts to position Houston as a hub for this type of clean tech innovation. And we're helping to bring renewables to the heart of the city with BP and Lightsource BP, providing technical and regulatory support to something called Sunnyside Energy LLC. in converting the closed landfill in Sunnyside into a solar farm. Sunnyside is a public-private partnership to convert the 240-acre closed landfill in Sunnyside into the largest brownfield solar installation in the nation. It's a strong example of how the City of Houston is working to find innovative public-private solutions to address historic environmental justice concerns, climate change, and economic development in some of these underserved communities. It's anchored by a 50-megawatt ballasted solar array that'll generate enough renewable power to power 5,000 homes and offset 120 million pounds of CO2 each year. While we're encouraged by the progress to date, and again, it's early days, we're by no means satisfied. More work remains, more ideas are needed, and more partners are required at the table to see the transition at this type of scale. So the global energy transition presents an opportunity for Houston to develop and implement strategies that'll help the planet while also improving the quality of lives for Texans. And I'm really proud to say that within the city that I live, BP's taken this as the first opportunity amongst the 10 to 15 other cities that we want a partnership with globally. And moving forward, we'll also be looking to advocate for and partner accordingly to advance our Protect the Planet aims. I'll skip. So I mentioned earlier, our three focus areas are net zero by 2050, improving people's lives, and caring for our planet. Amongst these five aims within protecting our planet, we want to focus on enhancing biodiversity, where our aim is to restore, maintain, and enhance biodiversity where we work. So from 2022 onward, we expect all new projects will have plans in place to achieve a net positive impact through the life cycle. We want to be water positive by 2035. With this aim, we plan to replenish more fresh water than we consume in our operations by that time. We want to champion nature-based solutions to deliver value and contribute to our people and planet aims in our operations throughout our business activities. We want to unlock circularity. This is about keeping materials in use for longer and valuing them throughout their entire life cycle. We aim to embrace circular principles in the design, operations, and the decommissioning of our operations globally. And finally, sustainable purchasing. This is something that I heard quite a bit about at lunch today in the conversation, but working with our key suppliers to embed sustainable practices, focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing the circularity of what we buy. These aims in particular are in their very early stages. They're bold. They will make a difference in driving meaningful and sustainable change for the cities, states, countries in which we operate. So taken together, everything that we've seen, it's a bold set of ambitions, and for a newly reinvented company. There's a baseline of work and some of the deliverables that are underway that I've mentioned, but there's so much more to do, and the clock's ticking. 2030, 2050 is not that long in terms of what it takes to pace this energy transition or the transition occurring all around us in multiple facets as we move into a digital age. So I think most in this room know it intuitively, and some of us are just grasping the enormity of the paradigm shift and the very different and distinct conversation that we're having here in this room today about the future for our state, the future for our country, and the future for the world. It is a different world. And I'm absolutely convinced it's also a world that's not going to reverse course. We can discuss pace, we can discuss targets, but I don't think anyone here can responsibly advocate or support a proposition that we're going to reverse course on any of this. And it's the right thing to do. So I'm really energized, as are my BP colleagues and our partners, to position ourselves for that transition ahead. And I'm also really excited at some of the partnerships that exist in this room. Personally, we've got Horned Frogs and we've got Liquor on the Ranch. And then professionally within BP, there's numerous opportunities that we have, some of which I've highlighted within the state, and others of which we're going to be newly forming, particularly in an area like Texas and in a region like the United States in which BP has such a big presence. So I really do want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for listening. And I want to thank you in advance for the conversations that I know we're going to have. where we explore potential partnerships going forward. And I'm also looking forward to fielding any questions that you might have here in the coming minutes after we hear from our third panelist. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.